Oak Haven, Wyoming Territory. Early spring, 1878. The auctioneer grabbed a 10-year-old boy by the hair and yanked him off the ground. His mother threw herself between them, arms open, tears running, jaw set, and her voice tore across the frozen square like a rifle shot. "Please, don't separate my children." The crowd went silent. Then iron hooves on frozen mud. Slow, patient. A stranger on a roan horse reached into his coat, pulled out a single gold coin, and hurled it straight at the auctioneer's chest. "1 coin," he said, voice flat as a winter sky, "for all 5 children and their mother. Anyone care to outbid my Colt 0.45? The sheriff looked at the coin and went pale. "Stay right here, because this is where the story begins, and you are not going to want to miss what comes next." The snow was dying, but the cold was not ready to let go. Early spring in Oak Haven, Wyoming Territory, was a cruel thing. The mud sat half frozen in the streets. The sky pressed down gray and low, and in the center of town, beneath a makeshift wooden platform, a crowd had gathered for a spectacle that would have shamed any decent man into silence. Most of them stayed quiet anyway. Shame wasn't the reason, fear was. Lydia Mercer stood at the front of that crowd with her 5 children. She was 28 years old, sharp-eyed, proud-shouldered, and underneath all of it, terrified. She didn't show it. She had learned early that showing terror to men like these was the same as feeding blood to wolves. Behind her stood Samuel, her oldest at 10. He had his father's square jaw already. His hand gripped the back of her coat. Mary, 8 years old, had her arm wrapped around Toby, who was 5 and too young to understand what was happening, only that something was very wrong. Against Lydia's hips, one on each side, clung the twins, Noah and Sarah, barely 2 years old, still small enough that she could scoop them both if she had to. She intended to. 3 weeks had passed since Jeb died. 3 weeks since someone shot her husband in the back on his own land and rode off before anyone could get a good look at the horse. 3 weeks of grief she had not had time to feel, because the very next morning a man in a fine coat had appeared at her door with a stack of papers she had never signed. Debt papers. Loan documents with Jeb's forged name on them. Jebediah Thorne didn't waste time on the dead. He wasted it on the living instead. She had tried the courts. Sheriff Gage had escorted her out of the building himself, smiling the entire time. She had tried writing to the federal office 2 towns over. No answer came. She had tried everything a woman with 5 children, and no money, and no husband could try in Wyoming Territory in the year 1878, which was not much. They had taken the ranch first. 3 of Thorne's men, with a padlocked chain and a paper signed by Gage. Lydia had stood on the porch and watched them lock her own front door. She had kept her face still and her spine straight, Samuel pressed against her back, and the twins on her hip, and she had not let any of them see a single thing. She had cried later, at night, when the children were asleep. That was behind her now. There was no room for it here. So here she stood. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man in a brown coat with ink-stained fingers. His name was Horace Bindle. He had a voice loud enough to carry 2 blocks, and he knew how to use it. He climbed the platform steps and cleared his throat like he was about to announce a horse race. "Debtors' indenture auction," he called out. "By order of the Oak Haven Credit and Land Office, the estate and obligations of one Jebediah Mercer, deceased, are hereby to be satisfied through the lawful indenture of his dependents." He made it sound legal. He had clearly practiced. 2 of Thorne's men stood close behind Lydia, big men. They had been there since she arrived, close enough that she felt their shadow on her neck. She had not turned to look at them. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Bindle pulled a paper from his coat. "The male child, one Samuel Mercer, age 10, is to be transferred to the Harrow Coal Company under a 7-year labor contract." 7 years. Samuel would be 17 before he saw daylight again, if he survived the coal mines at all. Lydia stepped forward. "That child is not a debt. Bindle did not look up. The remaining minor children are to be distributed among approved homesteading families as ward laborers and domestic charges. Distributed, like firewood. A murmur moved through the crowd. She caught a few faces. Mrs. Calloway, the seamstress, looked away. Old Pete Garland fixed his eyes on his boots. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke out loud. She understood why. They had their own families, their own fears. Thorne's reach was long, and everyone in Oakhaven knew it. Fear was practical. Fear kept food on the table. That still didn't stop the fury from rising in her. "This is illegal," she said, loud and clear. "These children have done nothing. They owe nothing. A debt made on forged papers is not a debt. And no law in this territory says a man's children belong to his creditors." Bindle finally looked at her. He had small, flat eyes. "Ma'am, the papers are certified." "By who? Gage?" She turned and looked directly at the sheriff, standing off to the left. He had a tin star on his chest and a gun on his hip, and absolutely no conscience behind either one. "You certified papers with a dead man's signature on them. You call that law?" Gage smiled at her and tilted his hat, said nothing. Bindle stepped down from the platform. He walked across the dirt slowly, crossed past Lydia like she wasn't there, stopped in front of Samuel, and grabbed the boy by his hair. A fistful, hard, like he'd done it before. Samuel cried out. A short, sharp sound that hit Lydia straight through. His feet left the ground for half a second, and then she was already moving. She got between them. She grabbed Samuel and shoved him back behind her. Bindle reached again, and she slapped his arm down hard enough that her palm went numb. "Don't touch my boy." The man behind her moved fast. He went around her side and had both twins in his arms before she could turn all the way. Noah first, then Sarah. They were small and confused and frightened. Sarah started screaming. Noah reached for his mother, with both arms open wide, fingers spread, and could not get to her. Something inside Lydia, Mercer, cracked wide open. Grief had nothing to do with it. This was fury, plain and hot. She lunged forward with her arms out, putting herself between all 5 of her children and every man in that square. Her voice came out raw and loud and shaking with everything she had. "Please don't separate my children." It rang across the whole square. The crowd went still. She was breathing hard. Tears ran down her face, and she didn't care, not even a little, because some things were too big for pride, and this was one of them. She looked at every face in that crowd, one at a time, and she made sure each one of them had to look back. "These are my children," she said. Her voice dropped, but it did not soften. "They are not property. They are not labor. They are not something to be handed out and divided up because a greedy man forged their father's name on a paper. Whatever debts are owed in this world, my children did not make them. They will not pay them." Nobody moved to help her. She hadn't expected them to. But they were listening, every single one of them. And in a town this scared, that was the first crack in a wall. Thorne's man reached for the twins again, and Lydia pulled them both hard against her, backing up until she felt Samuel's hands pressing into her shoulder blades. Mary and Toby closed in on both sides. She held all 5 of them. Bindle raised his hand. "The auction will proceed." That's when they heard the hooves. Heavy iron shoes on frozen mud, slow, patient. A sound that was in no hurry and had no reason to be. The crowd shifted. Heads turned toward the far end of the road. A horse came into view. A big roan, trail-worn and steady. On its back sat a man who made no theater of arriving. He sat easy in the saddle, moving with the animal, unhurried, covering distance without fighting it at all. No urgency, no performance. He brought the horse to a stop about 40 feet from the platform. Tall, broad in the shoulders, his coat was dusty from the road, and his hat brim sat low. His eyes, when they finally found Lydia and her children, were the color of a cold gray sky, and completely still. The square was quiet. Lydia looked at him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know which side he was on. But there was something in his face when he looked at her children. She had seen it once before. On Jeb, the night a mountain lion got into the far pasture, and her husband walked out into the dark with just his rifle and his nerve, already decided. past the moment of doubt. A man who knew exactly what he was about to do. Bindle raised his hand to signal his men. The stranger on the roan did not move. Not yet. But his right hand drifted, slow and deliberate, toward the side of his coat. He was waiting for something. Lydia didn't know what. She held her children close, and she waited, too. His first move was not toward his gun. It was toward the post at the edge of the feed store, where he tied off his roan with a single wrap of the reins. The horse stood easy, didn't fidget, didn't shift. Animals take their cues from their riders, and this one had learned a long time ago that its rider didn't do anything in a hurry. Garrett Sterling stepped away from the horse and looked out across the square. He was 32, broad through the shoulders, in a way that came from labor, not from trying. His coat was the deep brown of road dust that had stopped coming out in the wash. His hat brim was low and straight. He had a face that didn't give much away, which was less a personal habit than a professional one. And the quietness of it wasn't emptiness. There was a great deal going on behind those gray eyes. He just hadn't decided yet what he was going to do with it. He read the square in about the time it took most men to read a sentence. The platform. The auctioneer with his papers. Thorne's men in their positions around Lydia Mercer and her 5 children. Gauge over by the wall. Posture easy, expression satisfied. The crowd pressed around the edges. Heads down, not leaving, but not acting either. Fear could do that to a town. It didn't take a villain on every corner. It just took enough people convinced that looking out for themselves was the only sensible option. He understood that. He didn't judge it. He just wasn't built for it. He moved through the crowd without announcing himself. People shifted. They didn't know why exactly. They just felt the shape of him coming and made room. He worked his way forward until he stood about 20 feet from the platform, and he stopped there and crossed his arms and watched. The auctioneer had gotten himself reorganized. He had his papers back in hand and his voice back up to full volume, and he was pointing at Samuel Mercer again, 10 years old, standing at his mother's shoulder with his jaw tight and his hands balled at his sides. A man stood to Garrett's left. Heavy-set flannel coat, the ruddy face of a farmer who had spent a lot of winters outdoors. He glanced at the children and shook his head slowly and said, just loud enough to be heard, 5 children. Lord above, that's a burden no sensible man signs up for. A widow, 5 mouths, a mess of debt on top. Who in their right mind volunteers for that? Nobody, the man on his other side said. No malice in it. Just plain agreement. 5 kids. That's not charity. That's a life sentence. A woman near the back said something Garrett didn't catch, but the tone was the same. He didn't look at any of them. He was watching Lydia Mercer, watching her hold herself absolutely still, while the auctioneer pointed at her oldest son and recited numbers. There was something remarkable in that stillness. It was not the stillness of surrender. It was the stillness of someone who had already spent everything they had on screaming and was now spending what was left on not breaking. He'd seen that before. On different kinds of fields, in different kinds of battles. He'd never found a good reason to stand by and watch it happen. Bindle raised his arm. The male child, Samuel Mercer, age 10, is hereby to be transferred to the Harrow Coal Company under a 7-year labor indenture. Hold it. Garrett didn't raise his voice. He said it the way you'd say it to a horse at a fence. Even, clear, carrying. It stopped the square cold. Bindle looked up from his papers. The crowd went very quiet. Garrett walked forward into the open space in front of the platform. He didn't rush. He stopped about 15 feet from Bindle and stood there and looked at the man, and Bindle, for all his practiced authority, found that he could not quite find what to say next. He tried. The auction is a matter of certified legal. Garrett reached into his coat. Not fast, deliberately slow. His hand went to the inside breast pocket and came out with a coin, and he held it between his thumb and forefinger for a moment, where everyone could see it. The $20 gold double eagle caught what little light the gray morning had to offer. Even at distance, people near the front recognized the weight and color of it. A ripple went through the crowd. Not noise. More the opposite. The kind of silence that lands when something changes. On the frontier in 1878, a $20 gold piece was not a small thing. It was a month of wages, sometimes two. It was a good horse, or half a milk herd, or a full winter's worth of supplies bought at fair prices. Most of the families standing in this square had never held one. Some of them never would. Garrett held it like it was a button. He looked at Bindle for one flat second. Then he threw it, hard, fast. No arc to it, just a straight line through the air, and it hit Bindle square in the chest before the man's hands came up. Bindle grabbed at it with both palms pressed to his coat front, staggering back half a step, and clutched the coin there while he worked out what had just happened. The square was still. One coin for all 5 children and their mother to clear the ledger, Garrett said. His voice was the same as before. Perfectly level. Almost bored like he was reading a train schedule. Anyone care to outbid my Colt 0.45? His right hand was at his side, nowhere near his holster. But it was there, and it was obvious. And nobody in the square had any interest in testing the distance between those two facts. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Bindle looked left. He looked right. He found no guidance in either direction. Then boot heels crossed the frozen mud, measured steps. Gauge. The sheriff came across the square the way he always walked. Unhurried, assured. A man who had never been in a room he didn't own. He held his hand out to Bindle without breaking stride, and Bindle placed the coin in his palm without a word. Gage turned the double eagle over, looked at the face. Then, with the casual habit of a man who checked things by reflex, he tilted the coin and looked at the rim. His hand went still. He tilted it again, held it up slightly into the pale light. The rim engraving was fine. Precision work. Not stamped by any mint. Done by hand, by someone who knew exactly what they were marking and why. The U.S. Marshal Service, Gage's expression did not collapse. He was too controlled for that, but something moved behind his eyes. A rapid private recalculation. He brought the coin down slowly and looked across the open space at Garrett. Garrett looked back at him. Nothing in his face suggested he cared what Gage was thinking. He might have been looking at a fence post. That was its own kind of message. Gage held Garrett's gaze for a long moment. Then he closed the coin in his fist and turned to Bindle and said something too low for the crowd to catch. Bindle's eyebrows went up. He asked something back. Gage said it again, slightly slower, and Bindle nodded and began folding his papers. His fingers moved quickly and without their earlier confidence. Thorne's men looked at each other, looked at Gage. Gage did not look at them. He was still watching Garrett, with the careful expression of someone storing information they intended to use later. Then, he stepped back from the center of the square, not retreating, never retreating, just removing himself from the immediate equation. The crowd breathed again. Garrett turned his back on Gage, deliberate. He walked across the open ground toward Lydia Mercer and stopped a few feet in front of her. She had been watching all of it, every second. She stood with the twins against her sides, and her older children fanned around her, and her eyes were sharp and unreadable and fixed on him, with the focus of a woman who could not afford to read this situation wrong. "My name is Garrett Sterling," he said. "I've got a ranch about 6 miles northeast of here. You and your children can stay there while we sort this out." "Sort? What out?" she said. "Whatever it was that got your husband killed and got these men so interested in your land." She looked at him, searching his face for something she hadn't been told to trust yet. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed, "you don't. I have no reason to trust you." Also true. He didn't push further. He didn't soften it with a smile, or sweeten it with a promise. She had already been made enough promises by men who thought she'd take them on faith. He wasn't going to add to that pile. He just waited. She looked at her children. Noah, half asleep on his feet, leaning against her coat. Sarah still hiccuping from the crying. Toby shivering, looking up at his mother with eyes that asked her something she didn't have an answer for yet. Mary holding Toby's hand and holding herself together by sheer discipline. Samuel at her shoulder, watching Garrett with an expression older than 10 years, had any business producing. Lydia looked back at Garrett. 6 miles, she said. Northeast. Clear road most of the way. She reached down for Noah's hand, lifted Sarah with her other arm. Samuel, Mary, take his other hand. Samuel said, "Yes, ma'am," and moved without being asked twice. Lydia gave Garrett a single nod. One firm, brief motion of her chin. No warmth in it, no gratitude, no trust. Just acknowledgement. He accepted it. He went back for the roan. At the edge of the square, he ran the numbers on 6 miles and 5 children and 2 toddlers and came up with a problem. He looked at Toby first. 5 years old, knees already red from cold. He picked him up around the middle, two-handed, and set him on the saddle. The boy grabbed the horn with both fists, and his eyes went huge. "You've ridden before?" "A little," Toby said. "On our horse." Before they took it. Garrett put the reins in his hands. Toby held them so hard his knuckles paled. He looked down at the ground from the height of the saddle like it was a considerable distance, which, to a 5-year-old, it was. "You're doing fine," Garrett said. Then he turned to Lydia and opened his arms slightly. For Sarah. She hesitated. One breath. He didn't rush it. Then she passed the baby to him. He held Sarah against his chest, with his right arm, stiff and deliberate, the way a man holds something he is absolutely committed to not dropping. The baby grabbed a handful of his coat lapel and looked up at him with complete calm, the way the very young sometimes trust the very serious, without knowing any good reason to. They moved out. The crowd made way and kept their silence. Lydia walked with her chin forward and her eyes straight. Samuel matched her stride. At the edge of town, the road turned northeast, and behind them, Oak Haven fell away. The platform, the paperwork, the audience, the silence out here was a different kind. Clean. They walked for a while without speaking. The mud at the road's edge was half-thawed, and the cold still had some weight behind it, but the wind had settled. The sky was gray and vast in the way of open country, and around them the land stretched out in pale grass and frozen creek beds, and the skeletal outlines of cottonwood stands. Mary walked close to her mother and looked up at her once. Lydia looked back at her, and the look said, "We're all right," even if it wasn't sure yet. At some point, Samuel drifted to walk alongside the roan level with Garrett's arm. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, without looking up, "Are you a law informer?" Garrett said. "But that coin," Samuel chose his words. "The sheriff saw something on it." "Noticed that, did you?" "He went different," Samuel said. His face went different. Garrett looked down at the boy walking beside him. "You pay attention. My father said it was important. Your father was right." Samuel processed that. He walked a little straighter. They covered the miles with no further ceremony. Toby fell asleep on the saddle somewhere around mile 4, and Garrett's free hand moved to the boy's back without thought, steadying him. Noah walked without complaint and never asked to be carried, though by mile 5 his steps had shortened considerably. Mary kept pace. Samuel kept watching the horizon, the road, the surrounding hills, the same systematic attention that had clocked Gage's expression in a crowded square. The ranch came into view at mile 6. Sterling Ridge sat high on the edge of a canyon, cut into red-brown stone, backed against the ridge face and looking out over a wide valley below. It was not a pretty place. It had not been built to be. The fences were heavy timber, the kind meant to hold against something that really wanted in. The buildings were stone on the bottom and thick-hewn log above, and the main house had a second-story window that faced south with a view of every direction anyone could approach from. It was built by someone who had thought about trouble before it arrived. At the gate, leaning on a fence post with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who had been watching them come since the half-mile mark, stood the most thoroughly weathered human being Lydia Mercer had ever seen. He was old, maybe 65, maybe older. He had a white beard, like the business end of a mop, and 2 eyes, blue as noon sky, and the posture of a man who had survived things that would have broken anyone with less stubbornness. He looked at the children, and at Lydia, and at the baby in Garrett's arm. Then he looked at Garrett. "Went to the auction," the old man said. "I did," Garrett said. "Come back with a family, I did." The old man was quiet for a long moment. He pushed off the post. He looked at the children again, one at a time. He had a particular look for each of them. Not soft exactly, more like steady. The look of someone who decided things fast and didn't need to second-guess himself about them. "Ephraim Tanner," he said to Lydia. "Most people call me Grizzly, though I can't say I asked them to." "You must be the Mercer woman, Lydia," she said. He nodded once, looked at the twins, looked at Samuel, looked back at Lydia with those pale blue eyes. "Well then," he said, "better come inside before those babies freeze." He turned and walked toward the house, and they followed. The house was warmer than it looked. Lydia registered that first, stepping through the heavy front door behind Ephraim and letting it close behind the children. A cast-iron stove in the main room put out steady, dry heat. The walls were thick stone and didn't whisper. There were no gaps in the shutters letting cold fingers of air through. It was a house someone had spent serious time making tight. She let herself take a single breath of warm air. Just one. Then she started cataloging. 2 rooms on the main floor. A large open room with a long table, the stove, a set of shelves holding food stores and tools, an inner room with a door, probably Garrett's quarters, a staircase going up against the east wall, and a landing above with 2 closed doors. The furniture was plain and heavy and built to be used hard. No pictures on the walls, no curtains on the windows. On the table, a half-carved piece of wood, some kind of small animal, sitting beside a folding knife and a thin dusting of shavings. The man lived like a soldier on extended posting. Everything functional. Nothing extra. Toby was still half asleep, carried in by Garrett, and set on the bench beside the table, where he blinked and looked around and apparently decided everything was acceptable, because he leaned against the table edge and shut his eyes again. Noah and Sarah, now that there was warmth, woke up fully, and both began making opinions known about it. Ephraim had already pulled a pot to the stove without being asked and was measuring water into it. He moved around the kitchen end of the room with the practiced calm of a man who had been feeding people in rough conditions since before Lydia was born. "There's a room upstairs," Garrett said, behind her second door. "It's got 2 beds in it. The children can use it. I'll clear the front room down here." Lydia turned around. "What is this?" she said. He looked at her. "What is what?" "This." She gestured at the room. "The warmth. The pot on the stove. Him. What is it you expect in return for all of this? Because I am not a woman who takes charity without understanding the cost, and I am not in a position right now to be surprised." He held her gaze without any visible offense. "I don't expect anything," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." He moved to the table and picked up the folding knife, not to do anything with it, just to move it off to the side and make room. "You can work, if working is what makes you comfortable. There's enough to do on a ranch this size. Cooking, mending the kitchen garden when the ground thaws. You don't have to, but I won't stop you." "I'll work," she said immediately. He looked at her. Then he looked at her hands, which were still red from the cold and shaking slightly from the morning. Then he looked at the twins, who were sitting on the floor near the stove, with Sarah chewing on her own fist, and Noah already investigating the underside of the table. He set the knife down, "Mrs. Mercer." His voice was not unkind. But there was nothing yielding in it either. "I don't buy slaves. Human dignity isn't measured in gold. That coin didn't buy your freedom. It protected your right to remain a family." She looked at him. He continued, "What happened out there this morning was an injustice, and paying off the bill on an injustice doesn't make it legitimate. Your children don't owe me labor. You don't owe me labor. You owe me nothing." The room was quiet except for the sound of Ephraim's spoon in the pot, and Noah conducting an investigation beneath the table. "Then why did you do it?" she said. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. the same way someone might say the sky was gray this morning. Flat, factual. No performance attached to it. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure she'd ever heard a man say it without expecting something back. She looked away first, not in defeat. She just needed a moment that wasn't his eyes. "The room upstairs," she said. "Can the children see it?" "Samuel," Garrett said. The boy looked up from where he had been quietly examining the shelves. "You want to see where you'll be staying?" Samuel looked at his mother. She nodded. He straightened and said, "Yes, sir," and followed Garrett toward the stairs with the older children behind him. Ephraim watched them go. He stirred the pot and didn't look at Lydia and said, in the tone of someone making a general observation about the weather, "He's a better man than he looks like." "He's a hard man to read," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He tasted whatever was in the pot and made a private judgment about it. Hard men usually are. Doesn't mean they're hard all the way through. She let that sit and went to scoop up Sarah before the baby ate something off the floor. The afternoon arranged itself without being planned. Ephraim had a natural understanding of what 5 cold and hungry children required, which turned out to be broth, bread, and no sudden movements. He produced all 3 with minimal fuss. Mary helped without being asked, standing at his elbow and handing him things, and he accepted her help with the matter-of-fact dignity of someone who never made children feel small for trying. Garrett came back downstairs after getting Samuel and Mary sorted with the room. He stood in the main room for a moment, in that way of his, assessing the situation, and then sat down at the far end of the table and picked up the carving he had left there before he went to town. Lydia watched him from the corner of her eye while she settled Noah. It was a crib, or it was going to be. The piece of wood in his hands was meant to be a small decorative panel for a crib side, carved with the rough shape of a running horse. She could see what it was supposed to be. The horse's head was clear enough, but the legs were not cooperating, and Garrett's hands, which were obviously capable with the knife, were working at a scale they were not comfortable with. He kept stopping, looking at it from a different angle, starting a cut and then pulling back. He did not ask for help. Sarah, sitting on the floor, noticed him, the way babies notice things that are moving and interesting. She pushed herself up on her hands and began crawling across the floor toward him. He noticed. He held very still. Sarah reached his boot, grabbed it with both hands to pull herself upright, and stood there looking up at the table, specifically at the piece of wood. "Da," she said, which was her word for most things. "No," Garrett said. "Da," she said again. He looked down at her with an expression of genuine uncertainty. The carving knife was in his right hand. He looked at it, looked at her, looked at the knife again. He put it on the table, out of reach. Then he sat there, looking at the baby standing at his boot, apparently trying to work out the next step. Lydia watched this from across the room, with her arms folded. "She wants up," she said. He looked at her. "She's standing at your knee and saying your name," Lydia said. "She wants you to pick her up. She doesn't know my name. She doesn't know anyone's name yet. She says da for things she wants. You're a thing she wants." Lydia paused. "You can say no. She'll survive." He looked down at Sarah again. Sarah looked up at him and said da-da with considerable confidence. He put his hands under her arms and lifted her, and she landed in his lap and grabbed his coat the way she had grabbed it on the road, one small fist full of lapel. She leaned sideways to look at the carving and reached for it. "No," he said again, pulling it out of range. She switched to the knife. He moved that too. She decided the buttons on his coat were acceptable and began working on those instead. He sat there with the baby on his knee and his arms at his sides in the careful posture of a man who has just found himself in a situation he has no training for and is committed to not making worse. And Lydia turned away before he could see her almost smile. Dinner that evening was quiet and warm and crowded. Ephraim had produced a stew that had no business being as good as it was given the visible ingredients, and everyone ate. Toby fell asleep in his bowl, which Ephraim handled by picking the bowl up and replacing it with a folded sack before the boy's face got there. Mary ate with one hand and kept the other on Sarah. Noah ate everything in front of him and most of what was in front of Toby. Samuel sat beside Garrett and did not eat right away. He watched the room the way he had been watching everything all day, taking inventory, measuring. "This ranch," he said eventually. "You run it yourself?" "Ephraim helps," Garrett said. "But you own it. I own it." Samuel turned this over. "Can I help? With what?" "Anything. The animals, the fences, whatever needs doing." He said it straight. No performance of eagerness. Just practicality. "I know how to work. Our ranch wasn't big, but I did my share. I can do more now." Lydia looked up from the other end of the table. Garrett set down his spoon. He looked at Samuel for a moment with a directness that the boy held without flinching. "A grown man's job is to weather the storm," Garrett said. "A 10-year-old's job is to learn to read, ride a horse, and grow into a decent man. As long as I'm breathing, no child on this ridge sells his childhood for a debt." Samuel was quiet. "There's no debt," Garrett continued. "There was never a real debt, and even if there had been, it would not have been yours to pay." "My father's dead," Samuel said. It wasn't an argument, just a fact he was presenting. "I know it. Someone has to be the man of the family." "The man of the family," Garrett said carefully, "does not mean the one who works himself into the ground at 10 years old. It means the one who takes care of the people around him. Right now, taking care of your mother and your sisters and your brothers means staying in school, staying healthy, and letting the adults in this house handle what the adults need to handle." Samuel sat with that for a moment. He turned back to his bowl and took a spoonful. "Is there a school near here?" he said. "Oak Haven has one, 2 miles south." "2 miles is fine," Samuel said. "I can walk 2 miles. You can also ride," Garrett said. "Ephraim has a horse that needs the exercise." Samuel's head came up. He looked at Ephraim, who was studying his stew with great interest and failing to hide the fact that he was fighting a smile. "That's true," Ephraim said. "Old Biscuit gets lazy in spring. Somebody ought to keep him honest." After dinner, Lydia put the twins to bed in the upstairs room, one on each side of Mary, who accepted this arrangement without protest and was asleep before Lydia got to the door. Toby was already gone. Samuel sat up by the window with the stub of a candle and one of the 3 books he had somehow managed to keep through the entire preceding disaster. Because Samuel was the kind of person who knew what mattered and held on to it. Lydia came back downstairs. The main room was empty except for Garrett at the table, the carving in front of him again. He had the knife in his left hand and was looking at the horse's legs like they had personally offended him. She sat down across the table without being invited and looked at the carving. He said nothing. Kept working. "The back legs are too short," she said. He looked at her. "On the horse. The back legs. They need to be longer and carry more curve in the haunch. A horse's power comes from the back end." He looked at the carving, looked at her. "Do you carve?" he said. "I watch," she said. Jeb used to whittle when he was thinking. I paid attention. He set the knife down and pushed the carving across the table toward her. She picked it up, turned it over. The horse's head really was good. Strong jaw, alert ears, one good eye that had real personality in it. He had a better hand than he was giving himself credit for. "This is a lot of work for a crib panel," she said. "The twins don't have one," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "They've been sleeping in the same one," she said. "They were born together. They sleep better together." "I didn't know that," he said. "Now you do." She passed the carving back. "The crib you're making. Is there room for 2? He looked at the wood in his hand. "I could make it wider. If you add a second panel on the other side, match this horse, and make them facing each other, the twins would have something to look at when they wake up." He nodded slowly. "That's a better idea than what I had. Most ideas involving children are better than what men have." "First," she said. It came out sharper than she meant it. But he didn't react to the edge of it. He just picked up the knife and went back to work on the legs, adjusting his angle. And after a moment, they were not talking. but the silence between them had shifted into something that did not require filling. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The ridge caught it and redirected it, and the house held. The stove put out its steady heat. Somewhere upstairs, Noah made the particular sound he made when he rolled over in his sleep, and then there was nothing. Lydia sat at the table and watched a man she did not know try to carve a better horse. She still didn't trust him. Not yet. Trust took time and evidence and more mornings like this one. And she was not a woman who cut corners on things that mattered. But the children were warm and fed. They were together. The door was solid, and the stove was lit, and nobody in this house had looked at her 5 children like they were a problem to be divided up. That was not nothing. She did not say any of this out loud. She didn't need to. She sat with it quietly in the warmth of the room while the wind moved over the ridge and the candle threw its small light. And she decided that tomorrow she would start to learn the shape of this place, the routines of it, the needs, the work that needed doing. She would carry her own weight. She always had. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she was not doing it alone. The railroad was the answer to everything. Garrett figured it out on a Tuesday, 11 days after the auction. He was at the table with a spread of land deed records in front of him, and a cold cup of coffee going untouched at his elbow when the letter from his federal contact arrived by way of Ephraim and the postal rider out of Cheyenne. He read it twice, then he set it flat on the table and looked at it without touching it. For a long moment, the Union Pacific had commissioned a federal survey the previous fall, a new southern spur line through the Wyoming high country. The survey was supposed to be confidential, the kind of confidential that cost serious money to get access to. Thorne had access. The planned route ran directly through the Mercer homestead, through several other properties too. But the Mercer land sat at the critical point, a natural creek crossing and canyon passage that any engineer building in this terrain would have to use. Without that land, the alternate route cost twice as much and lost months of construction time. The land wasn't worth what Thorne was spending to take it because of what it was. It was worth a fortune because of what was coming through it. Jeb Mercer hadn't died over a fabricated debt. He died because someone found out he knew. Lydia came in from the kitchen and read the letter over Garrett's shoulder. She didn't ask permission. He didn't indicate she should wait. Her jaw tightened as she got further into it. He found the survey, she said. Looks that way. Jeb was careful about maps. He always studied them. Every survey that passed through the county, he got a look at it. She straightened up. Someone saw him with it and told Thorne, "That's what I think, too." She was quiet for a moment. Working through it, she didn't need to be walked through the logic. She was already 3 steps ahead and checking her work. "There's a man named Crick Dobbs," she said. Thorne's overseer on the eastern parcels. He and Jeb had a run-in over fencing 3 months before Jeb died. If anyone saw Jeb with those maps and carried it back to Thorne, it was Dobbs. "You know where Dobbs drinks?" "Harlan's Saloon, in Millhaven, 7 miles east." He looked at her. "It's not safe for you to be in Millhaven," he said. "No, it's also not useful for you to walk into Harlan's as yourself. Millhaven talks to Oakhaven. Thorne would hear about it before you made it back." He turned this over. She was right on both counts. She was already thinking past him. He had noticed that about her. She didn't wait to be shown where the problem was. She found it herself and had moved on to solutions before most people were done identifying the obstacle. "We'd need to go in as someone else," he said. "There's a traveling merchant who works this part of the territory every few weeks," she said. "Sells dry goods. He doesn't come from around here, and nobody tracks him much. You could be him. And you?" She met his eyes. His wife. They went 2 days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon. A wagon on the Millhaven Road with a man in a broad hat and a canvas coat at the reins, and a woman beside him in a plain brown dress with her hair tucked beneath a bonnet. Ephraim had the children at the ranch. Mary had been given clear instructions and the authority to enforce them, which she took seriously. Samuel had been told plainly and honestly that they were going to find out what happened to his father. He had nodded and gone to help Ephraim with the horses without another word. Harlan's saloon was low and long, with fogged windows and a hitch rail out front. They went in together. Lydia carried a basket. Garrett kept his voice easy and his hat brim level. And they took a table near the wall, with a clear sightline across the room, and Lydia made conversation with the barkeep's wife about road conditions, while Garrett let the room settle around him. Dobbs was at the bar, third from the end. Rangy man in his 40s, drinker's red nose, restless hands. He talked too loud and too much, the way men do when guilt is pressing on them, and whiskey isn't moving it the way they need it to. Garrett listened. Over the next 40 minutes, Dobbs produced most of what Garrett needed without being asked a single question. 3 references to a piece of land he had looked at in the fall. 2 passing mentions of maps he had no business seeing. 1 comment about Jeb Mercer that he cut off mid-sentence, glanced sideways at the room, and buried in his next drink. It was enough. Garrett stood, put money on the table for the coffee, and touched Lydia's arm. Time to go. The door opened. 2 men stepped in from the cold. Lydia recognized them before Garrett did. Her hand went rigid under his on the table. Her eyes stayed forward, her entire body locked up with the particular stillness of someone whose blood has just gone cold. "Don't turn around," she said, voice low and level. "I see them," he said. He had been watching their reflection in the window glass for the past 5 seconds. Thorne's men. She had seen them at the auction. The larger one had pulled the twins from her arms. The larger one's gaze moved across the room, swept past Lydia's profile, kept going, came back. "We need to leave," she said. The larger man said something to the other. Both of them started moving. He put himself between Lydia and the door and said very quietly, "Get behind me and stay there." He did not draw yet. There were other people in the room. He was calculating. He had spent years in situations that required fast math, and he was doing it now. The larger man closed the distance in 4 strides and grabbed Lydia by the arm and yanked her around. He started to say something, and then Garrett's left hand came across hard, an open palm cavalry strike, against the man's gun arm that broke the grip cleanly. His right shoulder drove in and put the man backward into the bar hard enough to rattle every bottle on the shelf. The second man went for his gun. He cleared leather fast, genuinely fast, not fast enough. Garrett's Colt was already up, and he was already moving left, pulling Lydia out of the angle. The shot he fired went exactly where he aimed it, 6 inches left of the second man's ear, into the wall behind him. Not a miss, a message. A cavalry scout in the field could not afford to put bullets where people weren't supposed to be. He had practiced precision misses for years, and this one was perfect. The second man froze with his gun half raised. The larger man at the bar was working on getting his feet back under him. Garrett looked at him over the barrel of the Colt. "Sit down," he said. The man sat down. Nobody in Harlan's saloon moved or spoke. The barkeep's wife had both hands pressed flat on the counter. Dobbs was staring into his glass like he had decided the best course of action was to become invisible. Garrett looked at Lydia. She was upright, bonnet crooked, jaw set, completely intact. She gave him one brief nod. They walked out. The road back to Sterling Ridge went dark before they reached the valley turnoff. Neither spoke much. The cold had come down hard, and the stars were sharp and close overhead in the way they get when the temperature really intends itself. After a while, Lydia said, "You could have shot him." "I had what I needed from Dobbs," Garrett said. "A dead man can't testify, and I'd rather have living witnesses." She looked at the road ahead of her. Jeb would have shot him. Different approach. Better approach, she said. No flattery in it. Plain honesty. He glanced at her. She was watching the dark road. He looked back at it, too. They got back late and found the children asleep and Ephraim by the stove with his pipe and an expression that asked nothing. He looked at both their faces when they came in, made his assessment, and said, "Coffee's hot," and left it there. Lydia went upstairs and checked the children in order from oldest to youngest, her hand on each forehead in the dark. She came back down. Garrett was at the table, writing by lamplight. She took coffee from the stove and stood with it and let the warmth of the iron seep into her hands. She heard him at 2 in the morning. Not loud. A sharp sound. A voice. Then something hitting the floor. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. He was on the floor beside his cot, on his hands and knees, eyes open and not seeing this room at all. His breathing had gone fast and shallow, and his hands were pressed flat against the floor planks, like he needed to hold on to something real. He was saying words, low and fractured, names she didn't know, and commands that had no one to receive them. She had enough sense not to touch him without warning. She sat on the floor 2 feet away and put herself directly in his line of sight, and said his name once. Not loud, just Garrett. The way you speak to someone at a distance who can't quite hear you. His head came up. His eyes moved and found her face. He was breathing hard sweat at his jaw and his collar. His hands still pressed down like the floor might shift. She looked back at him and did not look away and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're at the ridge. You're in your house. It's quiet." He sat back slowly onto his heels. His hand went across his face. He said nothing for a long time. She stayed on the floor. She had seen grief take different forms. She had seen it go loud, and she had seen it go inside and burrow down and do its damage where nobody could reach it. She had not seen it like this. Old wounds that didn't know the war was over. A man who had locked everything away and found out that locked things don't disappear. They just wait. After a while, he said, "I'm sorry, don't be," she said. "I should have more control than—" "You have plenty of control," she said. "This has nothing to do with control. This is what happens when a person carries more than they should have to carry alone." He looked at her for a moment with something unguarded in his face. "You should go back to sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. "Are you going to?" A long pause. "Not tonight," he said. She got up and came back with coffee and sat at the table, and he eventually got up off the floor and sat across from her, and they did not talk about the war or the names or what he had been reliving in the dark of his own house. But they sat there together until the gray started at the window, and she saw it then, past the flat eyes and the measured voice and the deliberate distance he kept from everything, a man of real and deep honor, carrying wounds he had never been given the grace to set down, a man who shielded others at cost to himself, in war and in a Wyoming town square, as naturally as breathing. She understood him better before dawn than she had in all the days before it. The blizzard came without warning. That wasn't unusual for the Wyoming high country in early spring. The season changed its mind regularly, without apology. The sky that morning had been clear enough to see 50 miles in every direction, and by afternoon the clouds were stacked on the western ridge like a wall being built fast. And by full dark, the wind was screaming off the canyon face, and the snow was coming sideways. Garrett stood at the front window and looked out at exactly nothing. White on black, the outlines of the fence posts gone. The tree line vanished. He could see maybe 15 feet past the glass. Behind him, the children were asleep upstairs. Lydia had put them down early, ahead of the worst of it, and come back downstairs to sit by the stove with her mending, and not much to say. Ephraim had gone to the barn to check on the horses at 9 and come back at 9:15 with snow packed on his hat brim and a look on his face. "Tracks," he said. Garrett turned from the window. "East side of the canyon approach," Ephraim said. "Fresh, before the snow filled them in. I count at least 6 sets coming in from the tree line, maybe more." "When?" "Within the last hour." He stamped snow off his boots. "Somebody's moving in this." "Nobody moves in this unless they've got a reason that can't wait." Garrett looked at Lydia. She had already set her mending down. Thorne had been quiet for 10 days. That was its own kind of message. A man like Thorne, with his money and his sheriff and his patience, didn't go quiet because he had given up. He went quiet because he was getting organized. "How many horses in the barn?" Garrett said. 4. Move them to the stone lean-to on the north side. Take the lantern, but keep it hooded. He turned to Lydia. Wake Samuel. Just Samuel. Quietly. She was already on the stairs. By the time Samuel came down, Garrett had both rifles from the cabinet and his Colt loaded, and the ammunition from the lockbox spread on the table. Samuel came to the table and stood there 12 inches shorter than Garrett and completely steady. I need you to take your brother and sisters to the root cellar, Garrett said. Down through the kitchen. Stone floor, stone walls, one door. Take a blanket for each of them and the lantern from the shelf. You stay there with them and you do not come out unless I come for you personally or your mother does. Nobody else. What if... Nobody else, Garrett said. Understood. Samuel looked at the rifles on the table. He looked at Garrett. Yes, sir, he said. He went upstairs. A few minutes later, Lydia came down with the twins, one on each arm, and Toby half awake at her heel. Samuel had Mary by the hand. He was talking to her quietly as they came down the stairs, explaining something, and she was listening and nodding in the practical way. Mary did everything. Lydia passed the twins to Samuel. She pressed her hand against his face for 1 second. Then she let go. She went to the cabinet and took down the Winchester shotgun from the top shelf. Garrett looked at her. Second story, she said. South-facing window. If anyone tries to come in from that approach, I'll see them before they reach the fence. He had 3 responses to that and discarded all of them. She had already pumped the action to check the load. There's extra shells on the... I see them, she said. He gave her one nod and went to find Ephraim. They came at 11. Garrett heard them before he saw them. Sounds carry strangely in a blizzard, swallowed in some directions and amplified in others. And the first sound that reached him was the creak of the east fence going down. He was behind the woodpile outside the front door, flat and low, and Ephraim was 30 feet to his right behind the water trough, with a rifle and a belt of ammunition, and the cold competence of a man who had waited out worse than this in worse places. The first wave was 5 men. They came in from the east in a line, shapes in the white dark, moving fast. Garrett let them get to the fence line. Then he fired. 2 shots, both on target, and the line broke. Men went in different directions. More shots came from the north approach, and he understood that there was a second group coming wide, trying to pinch both sides at once. The fight was fast and loud and confusing in the way all fights in darkness are. He moved, didn't stay in one position, shooting from cover, relocating, shooting again, always moving toward the next place they would least expect him to be. He counted shots against what he knew and kept the number clear in his head. Above him, the south window opened and the Winchester spoke. Twice, then once more, then quiet up there, then twice again. She was calm. That was the thing that registered even in the middle of it. No panic in the spacing of her shots. Steady intervals. She was picking her moments and not wasting anything. From the north, Ephraim's rifle had its own rhythm. The old man had settled in behind a heavy fence post and was working with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 4 years in the Civil War, learning that calm outlasted urgent. The second wave came 10 minutes in. 5 more men from the western approach, using the blizzard as cover, and they were better organized than the first group. They split before they hit the fence, going wide to both flanks simultaneously. Garrett pulled back toward the house. That's when the barn went up. Somebody had gotten around the north side with a torch, and the barn caught in the first minute. The wet wood fought it briefly, but the hay inside was dry, and the fire found it fast. In 30 seconds, the barn was fully involved, orange light tearing through the white dark of the blizzard, turning the snow orange and black and making everything visible that had been hidden. Both sides could see now. That was equally bad for everyone. Garrett was at the corner of the house when he saw Samuel. The cellar door, it had come open. The boy was standing in the doorway, half out, looking at the barn with his face lit up orange, and one of Thorne's men had already spotted him and was crossing the yard fast with his gun arm coming up. Garrett ran. He covered the distance in 4 strides and put himself in front of Samuel with no time to do anything else. The shot hit him in the upper left chest. The force of it drove him into Samuel, and they both went down. The man who fired never got a second shot because Garrett, on the ground and bleeding, and aware of what had happened in the abstract way the body handles things it hasn't had time to process, put a bullet through the man's shooting arm at a distance of 20 feet. He heard Samuel's voice. The boy was saying something. He couldn't parse it. There was too much noise. He pushed Samuel back toward the cellar door. "Get inside," he said. His voice came out wrong, flat and strange. "You're inside, Samuel, now," the boy went. Then Ephraim's voice from the north side of the yard, "Fire in the hole." Garrett had just enough presence of mind to put his face down. The explosion, when it came, was not subtle. Ephraim had positioned the blasting powder at the canyon entry, the narrow throat of rock that was the only viable approach for horses and men coming in from the road below. The detonation went up and out, and the canyon walls on both sides came down in a cascade of rock and frozen earth that closed the entry completely. The concussion rolled across the ridge, and the barn fire wavered and flared in the pressure wave, and then the blizzard hit it from the west, and for a few moments, everything was fire and wind and the ringing after-silence of an explosion that had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The mercenaries, still on their feet, had no way back up and no way forward. The canyon behind them was gone. The blizzard in front of them was absolute. They retreated. Garrett knew they retreated because the shooting stopped. He processed this information from a position on the cabin floor, though he could not have said exactly when he had gotten there. At some point between the explosion and now he had made it inside, and the floor was solid under his back, and the ceiling above him was familiar, and he was very cold. Lydia was there. She appeared above him with a lamp in her hand, and her face very still. The shotgun was gone. She had her hands on his chest before he could say anything, and her face did not do what he expected it to do. It did not panic. It focused. "Ephraim," she called, and her voice was level. He appeared in the doorway a second later, with snow on his hat and black powder burns on both hands, and a face that aged 10 years when he saw the floor. "Get the children settled," she said. "Then get the kit from the top shelf." Ephraim looked at Garrett. He pressed his mouth flat. "Go," Garrett said. "You hush," Lydia said. Not to Ephraim. The barn burned out the storm. Through the window, Garrett could see the orange light of it against the white dark, the fire fighting the blizzard and the blizzard fighting back. The canyon entry was rock and rubble now. The road in was gone until someone dug it out. That bought them until dawn, maybe a little past it. Not much more. Garrett tried to sit up. His left arm did not cooperate. "Don't," Lydia said. You need to hold still." She had her hand pressed hard against his chest, and she was looking at what was under it with the focused, steady expression of someone taking a hard inventory. She was not going to cry. He could see that she had decided that. Whatever this cost her, she had already set the cost aside. "The children," he said, "are in the cellar with Samuel. They're all right. Ephraim is fine. A powder burn on his hands and about 20 years taken off him. But fine." She looked at his face. "Stop talking." He let his head go back against the floor. Outside, the barn burned in the blizzard, and the smoke rose, and the canyon was sealed, and the enemy was out there in the dark somewhere, cold and regrouping, and absolutely coming back at first light. The oil lamp threw its yellow circle. The snow ticked against the glass. The fire outside was orange and enormous, and casting wild shadows through the windows, and Garrett Sterling lay in a pool of his own blood on his cabin floor, with Lydia Mercer's hands pressed against the wound, and the night was very long, and dawn was coming. The barn fire was the first problem. The man bleeding on the floor was the second. Lydia arranged them in that order because both needed handling, and she could not be useful to either if she tried to do them at once. "Ephraim," she said. "The cellar. Make sure the door's latched and the children can't hear this." He was already moving. She turned to the window. Through the glass, the barn was going hard. but the blizzard had shifted its weight west and was driving snow sideways into the open bay, and the burn was fighting it. The house sat 40 feet from the barn, and between them was open ground, and fire crossing open ground. In that wind would exhaust itself before it arrived. The stone lean to where the horses had been moved was holding. It could be managed. She went to Garrett. The bullet had entered high on the left side of his chest, below the collarbone and above the heart. She pressed her folded apron against it and felt how fast the bleeding was moving and made her calculation. He was watching her, eyes clear. He had not gone into shock yet, which told her she had time. Not much, but enough. "Whiskey," she said. "Bottom cabinet shelf. And the tin kit from the top." "Top shelf," he said. "I see it." She already had it down. Clean cloth, needle, thread already waxed, a thin-bladed knife, and a small brown bottle of carbolic that she had not expected to find on a rancher's shelf and noted without comment. She laid them out on the table, in the order she would need them. She put the blade of the knife in the lamp flame and held it there. "You've done this before," he said. "My father was a doctor," she said. She did not look up from the blade. "I wasn't trained, but I was present for more of his work than he probably intended," he said. "Watching carefully was more useful than any book, because your hands could forget a lesson, but your eyes kept what they saw." He was right. He usually was. Ephraim came back from the cellar. Children are settled. Samuel's got them calmed. Fire's not spreading, the wind's pulling it south and down. "Put something wet over the woodpile outside the east wall, just in case," she said. He went without asking why. That was one of the things she had come to understand about Ephraim Tanner in the weeks at the Ridge. He did not require explanation. You gave him the task, and he trusted you had thought through the reason. There was something deeply steadying about that, in a moment like this one. She poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup and brought it to Garrett. "All of it," she said. He looked at the cup, then at her, then he drank it. She told him plainly and specifically what she was going to do. He listened without looking away and without asking her to stop, and that was all the agreement she needed. She took the knife in her right hand, and she did not allow her hand to tremble, not because she was without fear, but because fear had no function here. It could wait. It had waited before, and it would keep. The bullet had not gone deep. The wound was bad but not complex, and she worked by the light of the mantel lamp with the full attention of someone who had decided this man was not dying on this floor tonight. Everything else, the fire, the cold, the mercenaries retreating somewhere in the dark, the sealed canyon, all of it was secondary to the next 5 minutes. Garrett made no sound while she worked. His jaw tightened, and his left hand found the leg of the table and gripped it. But he did not move. He breathed through it in measured counts, slow and deliberate, and her hands found the same rhythm, and it helped. She got what she came for, cleaned the wound with the carbolic, closed it with 8 stitches that her father would not have been embarrassed by, bandaged it tight. When she sat back, her hands were shaking. She put them in her lap, out of his sight, and looked at his face. "Still with me?" she said. "Still with you," he said. The words came out tired but even. She helped him off the floor, which required both of them and the edge of the table, and got him onto the cot in the back room. She pulled the blanket over him and placed the lamp on the windowsill, where it would give light without disturbing sleep, and she brought the stool from the corner and sat down beside him. "Sleep," she said. He closed his eyes. She sat. Outside, the blizzard continued its long work. The barn had burned itself down to something the snow could argue with. The orange glow was gone from the windows, just white dark and wind now, and the house held against both. The fever arrived around 2 in the morning. She was half asleep on the stool when she heard him. Not a cry, a voice, low and fractured, speaking to someone in a room that had nobody in it. She sat up fast and leaned toward him. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, glassy and far away. He was talking. A name she did not know. "Thomas," said twice, with something urgent pressed behind it. Then an order, the kind delivered at speed under pressure, Then something that was not words at all, and her hand moved to his arm before she made a conscious decision to move it. She watched him relive it across the next hour. The names came in fragments. Men he had served with, a sergeant at a river crossing, a corporal at a fence line in a state she couldn't identify from the pieces. She pieced together enough to understand it was the war. Old ground, 10 years cold and still burning, and then something else came through the fragments. Children, he said the word, then said it again, differently, with a weight behind it that had nothing to do with soldiers or campaigns. A village, she understood gradually, in the slow way you understand something told in pieces. A raid. Men following, orders that decent men had no business following. Children in the path of something that could not be stopped in time. Garrett had not fired. She was certain of that. But he had been there. He had seen it happen and not been able to prevent it. And he had been carrying that in the place where rest was supposed to live. Every night since. She took his hand. He was burning with fever and not in this room and could not hear her. She understood that. She talked to him anyway. You didn't do it, she said. Her voice was low and steady. You were there and you could not stop it, and those are not the same thing. Bearing witness to an evil is not the same as being the evil. You know the difference. You've always known the difference. That's why it costs you this much. His hand tightened on hers. She stayed, all of it. The names, and the orders, and the long silences between them. She did not try to redirect him or offer him comfort that would only be words. She just stayed, and her hand stayed. And when the fever crested near 4 in the morning, and finally broke, leaving him quiet and still and damp with sweat, she was still in the chair beside him. Dawn came gray and hushed. The blizzard had moved east. The ridge sat under 3 feet of new snow, and the silence that follows a storm, which is a different silence from any other kind. She was asleep with her chin on her hand when he came back to himself. He woke in pieces, the way the badly ill always do. She felt the shift of his hand before she opened her eyes completely. She straightened on the stool and looked at him. He was watching the window. Then her face. His color had returned to something closer to the color of a living man. The fever was gone. She could see it. Morning, she said. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at his hand, still loosely inside hers. How bad, he said. 8 stitches, and a week off your left arm. The bullet missed everything that mattered. The children. Upstairs. Asleep. Ephraim's with them. He let his head go back and breathed. I heard you, he said, last night. Some of what you said. I know. He looked at the ceiling. Then back at her. She met his eyes. This man who had thrown a gold coin across a town square, who had stepped between a bullet and a 10-year-old boy without hesitating, who lay awake in the dark and fought wars that had been over for a decade, because his conscience kept the accounting even when the army had closed the books. Garrett, she said. He looked at her. You aren't a ghost of violence, she said. True bravery isn't living without scars. It's choosing to shield others despite the pain of your past. He held her gaze for a long moment. He did not argue. He did not look away. He looked at her, the way someone looks at a thing they have been trying to locate for a long time, and have just, unexpectedly, found. Get some more sleep, she said quietly. She let go of his hand and stood and went to check on her children. He slept for 2 full days and she let him. The house ran anyway. That surprised no one paying attention. Lydia managed the cooking and the children and the watch schedule without drama or complaint, and Ephraim moved through the outdoor work with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. The barn was gone. The horses were in the stone lean-to. The canyon entry was solid rock and rubble and would stay that way until someone brought horses and crowbars and organized labor to shift it, which made the south road the only approach to the ridge and made the second-story south window the most important spot on the property. Lydia set a rotation. Herself, Ephraim, Samuel through the daylight hours. Samuel had objected to being cut from the night watch. She told him the day shift was the harder assignment, because boredom was a more dangerous enemy than darkness. It demanded discipline without the adrenaline to make discipline feel necessary. He considered this for a moment and took the post. Garrett was at the table on the fourth morning, left arm in the sling she had made from a flour sack, reading the federal letter again with the concentration of a man making up for lost time. He was healing, but Lydia had been thinking. She had been thinking since the night of the fire. Through the surgery and the fever and the long days watching the South Road, she had been turning one question over and over while she worked and while she watched. Thorne had sent 10 men. He would send more. He had money and reach and sheriff and no conscience, and the only thing slowing him at this moment was a sealed canyon and the knowledge that his last expedition had not gone as planned. That would not slow him long. A week, 2 at the outside. A man like Thorne did not read a setback as a signal to stop. He read it as a problem requiring a larger solution. Sitting on the ridge and waiting was not a strategy. It was hope dressed up as patience, and her father had said that hope without action was just another way of asking someone else to carry your weight. She made her decision on the fourth morning. She told Garrett over breakfast, set her coffee down, and said plainly that she intended to ride out to the surrounding homesteads that day. Under the fog, he looked at her. Thorne likely has riders watching the South Road. There's thick fog off the valley, she said. Came in around 3 in the morning. It'll hold until mid-morning at least. He was quiet. I know these families, she continued. All of them have lost something to Thorne's operation. The Harmons had their east pastures stripped from them on forged water rights. The Coopers lost access to the creek. Mrs. Martha Crane has been trying to organize something for months, but nobody has moved because nobody believes it's survivable. She looked at him across the table. They need to see that it is. They need to see someone still standing, and you're the proof, he said. I'm still here, she said. My children are upstairs eating oatmeal. After everything Thorne sent at this ridge, I am still here. Yes, I believe that counts for something. He did not argue with her. That was one of the things she had come to trust about him. He pushed back when the risk was real, but he had never once confused caution with her limitations, and he did not treat her judgment as something requiring his approval before it was valid. Take the gray mare, he said. She's quiet on the road. Ephraim watches the children. I'll be back before dark. If you're not, I'm coming after you. She looked at him, a man with his arm in a flour sack sling 4 days from emergency surgery. No, she said. You'll stay here with my children. A pause. Fair enough, he said. She rode out at 7 in the fog. The South Road was still and white and close. The fog sat in the valley like something poured into a bowl, thick enough that the cottonwood stands were shapes, not trees. The gray mare moved at an easy walk, and Lydia kept her eyes working the edges of the road without turning her head, and nothing moved except a crow that had opinions about the morning and then lost interest. The Harmon homestead was 4 miles south. She turned in at the gate, and a man in the yard recognized her and went still as a post. Mrs. Mercer. His voice carried something between relief and alarm. We heard about Sterling Ridge. Then you know Thorne isn't stopping, she said. I need 20 minutes with your family. I'll explain everything. She got her 20 minutes. She got more than that. At each kitchen table, she sat straight and laid out what she knew without softening it. The railroad survey, the forged deeds, the murder of her husband over a map he had seen that he was not supposed to see. She told them about the double eagle coin and the rim engraving and what it meant for the federal reach of what was coming. She told them about the master ledger and what it would mean in a circuit court if they could get their hands on it. She told them that isolation was what Thorne was counting on, because isolated families could be managed and divided and bought or frightened one at a time, and that the only thing that changed the math was people who refused to stay isolated. She told them the truth, and she let them sit with it. Mrs. Martha Crane was at the last stop, a tall widow of 50 with white-streaked hair and a spine like iron and eyes that had seen the full length of what men like Thorne could do, and were entirely finished being patient about it. She had coffee ready when Lydia arrived. Someone down the road had sent word ahead. She poured 2 cups and sat down across the table and said, "Tell me what you need." "Organized families," Lydia said. "Consistent testimony. Documented losses on paper. We have a former federal marshal with standing to request a circuit judge outside Thorne's reach, and we have the beginning of a paper trail. But evidence in front of one judge with one witness is a story Thorne can buy his way around. 8 families with matching testimony and documented loss is something a judge cannot ignore." Martha turned her cup in both hands. "People are afraid." "I know. I was afraid too. I still am." She held Martha's gaze. "But my children are alive and together. Because someone stood up at an auction and made it costly to do evil in public. We need to make it costly, and the only way to do that is to be visible together. Because visible together is what Thorne cannot dismantle one household at a time." Martha was quiet. She looked at the table. She looked at the window. Then she said, "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Which was not a yes, but it was not a no, and Lydia understood the distance between those two things. She rode back to the ridge in the afternoon, with the fog burned off and the sky going pale gold above the canyon walls, and in her coat pocket she had 8 signatures on a single sheet of paper. Not a legal document, not binding in any court, but 8 names from 8 families who had looked at her and decided she was worth standing next to. She was 2 miles from the ridge when the hair on the back of her neck told her something was behind her. She did not turn. She adjusted her angle and took the gray mare up a low rise at an easy walk. And from the top, she had a clear sightline back along the road. One rider, alone, stopped at the base of the rise, looking up at her. They regarded each other across the distance. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he came. A scout. Gage's or Thorne's, it made no difference now. She had been seen. They would know. She had been riding. They would spend the next several hours working out exactly why. And men like Thorne were good at that kind of arithmetic. She pressed the mare to a canter and covered the last 2 miles without stopping. That same afternoon, in a stone house on the north side of Oakhaven, Jebediah Thorne sat at the head of a long table and listened to Gage explain what the coin meant. Gage turned it in his fingers as he spoke. The rim engraving was faint, but exact to anyone who had seen one before. "Former U.S. Marshal Special Deputy," Gage said. "The coins were service markers during the Reconstruction period, field identification. Former status or not, his contacts are current, and his standing in a federal court is real. He can request a circuit judge independent of this territory's court system." Thorne looked at the coin. He was a controlled man. His anger showed in small, precise ways. The way his fingers went flat against the table's surface. The half-second of silence that ran longer than it should before he spoke. 10 men didn't come back from that ridge," he said. "No, sir. And the woman was riding today." "Yes, sir. The scout by the window had not moved from his post. I tracked her to at least 6 homesteads, possibly more. She was inside each one for 15 to 20 minutes. Nobody in the room filled the silence after that." Thorne's operation had been built on a specific architecture. Isolated families, managed individually, confronted with paperwork they could not challenge, and a sheriff they could not appeal past. It was not complicated. Complicated plans broke. Simple ones, applied with enough money and enough nerve, worked indefinitely. An organized coalition of homesteaders with federal marshal backing and consistent testimony was not a family he could isolate. It was not a widow he could discredit. It was the entire architecture coming apart at once. He felt the margin closing, and his men felt him feel it, and nobody spoke until he gave them something to do. "Blackwood Canyon," he said finally. "Everything we're moving through there, move it this week. All of it." He looked at Gage. "And find me a way into that ranch that doesn't cost me another 10 men. Gage nodded and pocketed the coin. The meeting ended. On a ridge 6 miles northeast, Lydia Mercer set 8 signatures on the table in front of Garrett Sterling and waited while he read them. He read carefully, set the page down, looked at her. She was road-dusty and cold, hair down from the last miles, and she did not do anything about either. She looked back at him and waited. "You did this in one day. I knew where to go," she said. "These families have been waiting for someone to knock first." He looked at the page again, at the 8 names written in 8 different hands, some careful and practiced, and some rough and pressed hard into the paper, as though the writer wanted to make sure it held. "This changes things," he said. "That was the point," she said. She crossed to the stove and held her hands over it, and from upstairs came the sound of the twins waking from their nap, and Mary's voice settling them outside. The ridge was going gold in the late light, quiet now. No wind off the canyon. The list of 8 names sat on the table between them. It was not an army. It was not a court order. It was not even a plan yet, but it was the first thing they had built together that Thorne had not seen coming. For now, that was enough. They had 3 days to get there before Thorne moved his papers. Garrett knew the ledger would travel with armed escort. He knew the route. Blackwood Canyon was the only practical road east from Thorne's operation. A narrow gorge cut between walls of stone that rose 50 feet on both sides and carried sound from one end to the other like a speaking tube. In winter, the floor stayed deep in shadow, ice in the creek bed. The walls ran close enough in places that 2 riders could barely pass. It was the worst possible place to move through with something valuable, which was exactly why Thorne would use it. A man who had operated in this territory for 20 years believed he owned everything in it, and men who believe they own the ground tend to stop thinking carefully about the ground. Garrett and Lydia rode out before dawn on the second day after the signatures. Ephraim stayed with the children, this time with both rifles and the clear instruction that Samuel was authorized to use the Winchester, if it came to that. Samuel had received this information without expression and gone to sharpen the kitchen knife, which was its own kind of answer. They reached the canyon at first light. Garrett read the terrain the way he had read every piece of ground since his cavalry years. He looked at the walls, the floor, the overhangs, the narrow places, and the wide ones. He walked the floor for a quarter mile without speaking. Lydia kept pace and let him think. Then he stopped and looked up at the east rim. "From up there," he said, "you can see the full length of the approach. 300 yards. Clear sight line." She looked up at the rim and back at him. 40-foot climb on the north face," he said. "Good footing. Sheltered overhang at the top. You'd be shooting across the canyon, not down into it, which means better angle on anyone trying to come up on the south side. And you take the canyon floor," she said. "The ledger will be in the wagon. The wagon can't leave the floor." He looked at her. "You'd be alone up there." "I was alone at the south window during the raid," she said. That was fine. He didn't argue the logic. They got into position an hour before Thorne's party arrived. The waiting was the hardest part, and Lydia had never pretended otherwise. She lay flat on the overhang with the rifle and looked down the approach road and thought about nothing useful for 55 minutes, while the cold came up through the rock and the morning stayed gray and still. She thought about Samuel sharpening the kitchen knife with that particular face. She thought about the twins who had started calling Ephraim Papa Grizz, which Ephraim endured with the expression of a man being slowly embarrassed to death and secretly enjoying every second. She thought about the man on the canyon floor below her, moving between boulders invisible. She heard Thorne's party before she saw them. Wagon wheels first, then hooves. They came into the canyon mouth in an easy column. 2 riders out front, then the wagon with a driver and a man riding beside it, with a rifle across his saddle, then 4 more riders behind. 8 men total. She counted twice. Then Gage, at the rear on a black horse, watching the rim. She pulled back half an inch. She did not know what Garrett's opening move would be. She had learned that about him. He had a plan, and he executed it, and the plan did not require announcing. She kept her eyes on the south rim approach, the angles from which riders could try to flank the canyon floor, and waited. The shot came from behind a granite slab 30 feet into the canyon. Garrett's first round took out the lead rider's horse, not the rider. A cavalry choice. It blocked the road and broke the formation without killing a man he might need to testify later. The horse went down hard, and the rider cleared it. And then everything happened at once. The wagon driver tried to reverse, had nowhere to go. The riders behind the wagon split, 2 going for the south wall and 2 pulling back for the canyon mouth. And that's when Lydia moved. The 2 men heading for the south wall were trying to find a way up and around. Fired once, high and deliberate, a warning shot that struck the wall face ahead of the nearest rider and threw rock chips across the man's chest. He pulled up hard. She had her second round chambered in 2 seconds, and she didn't fire it yet. She let him see the angle, let him understand that she was already there before he arrived. He turned back. The second man on the south approach had more nerve and less sense. He pushed his horse forward toward the wall base and started the climb on foot. She fired. The shot went through his coat shoulder, left side. He dropped, and he did not get up to try again. Below the canyon was noise and movement. Garrett moved through it, the way water moves. Fast in the open, gone at the walls, appearing again at different points. She tracked him without trying to. He had a particular economy of motion, nothing wasted, no drama, just one problem handled, and then the next. 2 men tried to pin him behind the granite slab, and he was not there when they got to it. The wagon driver jumped from the box and ran east, and she let him go. He was not the problem. The man with the rifle beside the wagon raised it toward Garrett's last position. She put a round 6 inches from his left boot, and he dropped the rifle and fell backward over his own heels and sat down in the snow with his hands up. 4 minutes in, the canyon was quiet. 5 men down or surrendered. 2 retreated out the canyon mouth. Thorne was in the wagon. Garrett had the wagon door open and Thorne on the ground before Lydia made it down from the overhang. Thorne was a large man, well-dressed even out here, with the face of someone who had spent years confident that consequences applied to other people. That confidence was doing poorly at the moment. He was on his knees in the canyons, with Garrett's Colt at his eye level and a ledger book sitting on the ground between them. Garrett had not opened the ledger. He hadn't needed to. The weight of it, in Thorne's hands, when they pulled him from the wagon, had told him everything. Lydia walked up and picked the ledger off the ground. She opened it. Columns of names, property descriptions, dates, amounts. 23 entries she could read at a glance, each one a family. Each entry told the same story in different amounts. She recognized 6 names from the signatures in her pocket. She saw her own name. She saw Jeb's. She closed it. Then she heard the boot behind her. Gage had not run. She turned, and he was 10 feet away in the middle of the canyon, standing apart from the surrender, gun already drawn. He had his eyes on Garrett and the expression of a man who had run the numbers and decided he had nothing left to lose, which made him more dangerous than anyone still hoping to survive. "Set it down, Sterling," he said. His voice was flat and final. Garrett looked at him. Then he holstered his Colt. Lydia's hand tightened on the ledger. "Gage saw it, and the book," he said. "Slide it over here." "No," Garrett said. Gage's finger moved on the trigger. Garrett moved. It was not fast in the showy sense. It was efficient, which is more dangerous than fast because it has no wasted space in it. He went left, inside Gage's angle, and closed the distance before Gage could adjust his arm. And the shot that went off hit the canyon wall, and the gun hand was already gone. 1 strike to the wrist. The pistol hit the snow. Then Garrett had Gage by the coat front, and Gage hit the ground and did not get up. He lay still. The canyon was quiet. Lydia stood with the ledger against her chest. Her heart was going hard, but her hands were steady. She looked at Garrett across the silence. He looked back at her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You?" He looked down at Gage, then back at her. "Getting there," he said. She held up the ledger. He nodded once. It was enough. The federal circuit judge arrived in Oak Haven on a Tuesday morning in April. His name was Elias Carmody. He was 60 years old and had a face like weathered chalk and eyes that had heard every lie a man could construct in a federal courtroom and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. He came with 2 federal deputies, his own court recorder, and a letter from Washington authorizing him to convene independent proceedings in the Wyoming Territory on matters of federal land fraud. Garrett's request had gone out 3 days after Blackwood Canyon. The answer came back in 8. The speed of that surprised the town. It did not surprise Garrett, who understood that the federal government moved slowly on many things, but moved quickly when someone handed it documented evidence of organized land theft tied to railroad expansion contracts worth millions of dollars. The trial took 4 days. Thorne's legal counsel arrived from Cheyenne with a briefcase and an air of absolute certainty that lasted approximately until Judge Carmody looked at the ledger for the first time. The counsel proposed a continuance. Carmody denied it. The counsel proposed an objection to jurisdiction. Carmody read the relevant statute to him from memory. The counsel sat down and opened his briefcase and began revising his expectations. Thorne had sent money ahead of his lawyers. Carmody's court recorder found the envelope on the first morning and placed it unopened on the judge's table. Carmody looked at it for a moment, handed it to his federal deputies for evidence, and called the court to order. Gage testified under oath on the second day, which surprised no one more than Gage himself. He had spent the days before the trial calculating his options and arrived at the conclusion that the evidence against him was comprehensive enough that cooperation was the only remaining card he held. His testimony was specific and detailed, and it matched the ledger entry by entry. 4 of the surrendered mercenaries testified similarly. By the 3rd day, the case had a spine that no amount of legal argument could collapse. On the 4th morning, Lydia took the witness stand. She wore her plain brown dress, the same one she had worn to Harlan's saloon, which she thought was appropriate. She sat straight. She looked at Judge Carmody. Then she looked at the packed gallery behind him. All the faces of Oak Haven and the surrounding homesteads pressed into the courthouse. 8 families among them who had ridden in the night before and sat in the front rows. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had written it and revised it and discarded the paper because the paper made it sound like a speech, and she did not want a speech. She wanted the truth, in the plain order it had happened, delivered to a room that needed to hear it. She spoke about Jeb, the map he had seen and what it cost him. She spoke about the morning of the auction, the forged papers, the auctioneer's hand in Samuel's hair, the twins torn from her arms. She kept her voice even, and she kept her face still. And she looked at the gallery, because the gallery was who it mattered to, not the lawyers. Thorne's counsel rose to cross-examine. He was efficient and practiced, and he asked questions designed to chip at credibility. Was she certain the documents were forged? Had she personally witnessed the survey maps? Could she confirm with documentation that her husband had seen the relevant federal materials? She answered each one directly, without elaboration or defensiveness, because the truth did not require decorating. Then she was asked whether she had any final statement. She did. She turned to face the room, and she let the silence hold for 1 full second. This West was built on the blood and sweat of honest families, she said, not on the greed of men who auction human beings like cattle. Every child, every woman on this frontier has an equal right to live, to be respected, and to own the fruits of their labor without fear. The gallery was completely still. The families in this room did not fail. They were failed. There is a difference, and the law was created to know that difference and act on it. What happened to my family happened to every family behind me. And it happened because one man decided that his money made him larger than the law. It didn't. It never does. And the only way it keeps working is if we accept it quietly. She paused. We are not accepting it quietly anymore. She stepped down from the stand. The gallery remained quiet for a long moment. Then Martha Crane, from the front row, put her hands together. The sound was dry and certain in the wood-paneled room. Then others, then all of it, the whole gallery, and Judge Carmody did not gavel it down immediately, which was not standard judicial procedure. He let it run for 5 full seconds, and then brought the room back to order with an expression that revealed nothing, except possibly the very slight adjustment of a man who has just heard something he intended to remember. The deliberation took 4 hours. Thorne sat at the defense table through the verdict reading with the posture of a man who had already begun the private work of recalculating what the next 20 years looked like from a territorial prison. His counsel had one hand pressed flat on the table and was not writing anymore. Judge Carmody read the verdict without theatrical pause. Jebediah Thorne, guilty of land fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and complicity in the murder of Jeb Mercer. Life imprisonment. Sheriff Rufus Gage, guilty on all counts pertaining to his cooperation with the Thorne operation. Stripped of his badge. 15 years. 4 additional co-conspirators. Sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years, depending on the degree of their involvement. All stolen land deeds were declared void. All properties were to be legally restored to their original holders within 60 days under federal supervision. The courthouse erupted. Outside on the afterward, Garrett stood beside Lydia in the pale April sun, while Oakhaven sorted itself out around them. Martha Crane embraced Lydia with the brisk efficiency of a woman who did not do things halfway. The Harmon family, all 4 of them, came and shook hands. Samuel stood just behind his mother, taking it all in with the systematic attention he brought to everything. Noah and Sarah sat on the steps sharing a biscuit Ephraim had produced from his coat, apparently from nowhere. Lydia stood in the sun and let the noise of it wash around her. The relief of it was not the loud kind. It was the quiet kind. The kind that arrives after something has been carried for a very long time and is finally set down, and the absence of weight is more overwhelming than the weight itself had been. Garrett stood next to her and said nothing. She was glad of that. She didn't need words right now. She just needed to stand in the sun and be still. After a while, she said, Jeb would have liked that, the verdict. He would have, Garrett said. A pause. He would have liked you too, she said. He had very little patience for pretense. He liked plain people. Garrett looked at her sideways. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one, she said. The sun moved across the steps, and the crowd thinned. Ephraim got the children organized in the wagon with the thoroughness of a man who had managed larger operations under worse conditions. Samuel climbed up last and sat straight on the board beside Ephraim and looked very much like someone who had just watched justice delivered and was filing it carefully for future use. Lydia stood at the wagon a moment before climbing up. She looked at Oakhaven, the square where she had stood with her children in the cold, and begged a crowd to hear her. The auction platform was gone. Someone had pulled it down. The square looked like a square now, just a square in a small town. Ordinary. She turned away from it and climbed up. They drove home. Summer came to the ridge in full. It came up from the valley in waves of green that climbed the canyon walls and filled the meadow below the house, with grass tall enough to hide a toddler, which Noah demonstrated by promptly hiding in it and declining to come out until Sarah crawled in after him. The cottonwoods by the creek went loud and silver in the afternoon breeze. The sky went the deep, uncomplicated blue of high-altitude summer, the kind that had no gray in it at all. The barn was rebuilt by June, not just by Garrett and Ephraim. The Harmon boys had shown up one Saturday morning with lumber and tools and the calm assumption that there was work to do, and they were doing it. The Cooper family came the following weekend. Martha Crane's son, who was 22 and strong as a post, showed up both times and worked without stopping and ate everything Lydia put in front of him. The ridge had become something different than what it had been. Garrett noticed it one evening on the porch. He had gone out to check the fence line, and came back to the main yard to find a situation. 3 different conversations in 3 different places. Ephraim and Toby by the corral. Toby on the fence rail. Ephraim explaining something about horses with the extensive patience he saved exclusively for children and animals. Samuel and Mary at the creek bank with some kind of construction project underway involving sticks and mud and an unclear objective. And on the south porch, Lydia in the chair with both twins, reading aloud from the small book she kept in her apron pocket. 1 twin on each knee, the 2 of them absolutely still in the way. Small children only go still when a story has them. He stood in the yard and looked at all of it. Sterling Ridge had been built as a fortified position. He had designed it that way. Stone below, sight lines everywhere, defensible approaches. It was built around the question of what was coming and how to stop it. It had become something built around different questions. What's for dinner? Who teaches Samuel the second cipher from the federal letters? How wide to make the new vegetable bed? How to explain to Noah that you cannot in fact befriend every crow in the territory, though it was admirable that he was trying. He was still standing there when Lydia looked up from the book and found him across the yard. She raised an eyebrow. He shook his head slightly, which meant nothing's wrong, just standing here. She went back to the book. In early July, Lydia rode out to her original homestead for the first time since the trial. She went alone. She had asked Garrett to let her, and he had said yes, without asking why, which she appreciated. There were things a person needed to see on their own terms. The house was standing. The fields had gone to early summer growth. The fence Jeb had rebuilt twice was still up, though the gate had a broken hinge. She sat on the horse in the yard and looked at all of it for a long while. She felt the shape of the life that had been lived here. Jeb at the fence line in the early morning. Samuel doing his lessons at the kitchen table. The twins, barely walking then, following each other around the yard in the particular way they had of moving like 2 parts of one thought. She felt it, and she let herself feel it, and she did not try to make it smaller than it was. Jeb deserved the full grief he always had. She stayed an hour, then she rode back to Sterling Ridge. 2 days later, she met with a woman named Clara Wells, a widow from the Eastern Valley who had lost her property to Thorne's operation and had nowhere to go with her 3 children. Lydia had been in correspondence with her since the trial. They sat at the kitchen table at the Ridge, and Lydia laid out what she had in mind. A lease arrangement on the Mercer homestead. Fair payment, structured as lease to own over 7 years. Clara would have her land and her house. Lydia would have an income that belonged to her and no one else. And a family who needed a home would have one. Clara Wells pressed her mouth flat and breathed hard for a moment and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Lydia said. "Just take care of the garden." "I'm particular about the garden." Clara laughed. It was a sudden, genuine sound, and it filled the kitchen. Lydia signed the papers that afternoon. The Mercer homestead went to someone who needed it, and the Mercer family stayed on the Ridge. It was early evening, the light going gold and long across the meadow, when Garrett came looking for her. She was by the fence, at the meadow's edge, watching the children. All 5 of them had been turned loose after dinner with the clear instruction not to get muddy near the creek, which they were interpreting broadly. Noah had mud on his elbows. Sarah had mud on her face and in her hair, and was delighted about it. Toby was attempting to teach Samuel a game of some kind that involved running in a circle, which Samuel was tolerating with patient, older brother dignity. Mary sat in the tall grass with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching everything, the small smile on her face that she saved for moments she was deciding to keep. The wooden horse Garrett had carved, the crib panel from the first week, sat propped on the fence post. The crib itself was inside, but the panel had migrated outdoors somehow, carried by Toby or Noah, and now it lived on the fence where it could be looked at. The back legs were still not quite right, but the head was good. It had personality. Lydia heard Garrett stop beside her. She didn't look at him right away. They watched the children for a moment together, the way they did things together now, without requiring an occasion for it. He said, "You signed the Wells papers this afternoon. How do you feel about it?" She thought about the hour at the old homestead, the fence Jeb had rebuilt, the kitchen table where Samuel had done his letters. "Like I did the right thing," she said. "And like the right thing is sometimes the hard thing, and sometimes it's both at once." He was quiet for a moment. "Lydia." She looked at him. He was looking at the meadow, at the children, at the light on the grass. Then he looked at her, and his face had the same quality it had in the moments she trusted most, which was nothing hidden, just him all the way through. "I don't want to be your savior," he said. "I want to be your equal partner in building a life." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the auction square, and the cold crowd, and the coin that had not been a purchase, but a declaration. She thought about the crib with the imperfect legs, and Sarah on his knee, and the night she had held his hand through the fever, and the morning he had looked at her across the table, like she had found something he'd lost track of. She thought about how trust was built, slowly, in the ordinary dailiness of shared work and shared trouble, and the 100 small moments where a person showed you who they were when nothing was watching. She knew who this man was. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "That's what I said." Something moved in his face. Not dramatic, just a loosening. An ease that settled in his jaw and around his eyes like a man who has been holding a position for a long time and has just been told he can stand down. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. In the meadow, Noah found the mud by the creek, and the chase that followed involved all 5 children, mud, shouting, and the complete abandonment of any pretense about the original instruction. Ephraim appeared at the corner of the barn, assessed the situation, and went back inside. The twins ended up in the creek. Samuel pulled them out. Mary laughed loud enough that it carried across the meadow. The wooden horse on the fence post caught the evening light. It was not a thing to cling to anymore. It was not a symbol of the terrible weeks when there had been nothing solid to hold. It was just a piece of carving on a fence, worn smooth at the nose from small hands kept outdoors because the children liked to look at it. A thing a family owned. That was all. Garrett and Lydia stood in the last of the summer light, with their hands joined, and the meadow wide and green in front of them, and the ridge at their backs. The canyon caught the wind and turned it, and across the valley below, the Wyoming Territory spread out in every direction, vast and patient, and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out under its enormous sky. But here on this ridge, there was nothing indifferent about any of it. There were 5 children running in a meadow. There was a man with a scar on his chest and an old war in his sleep that he was slowly, finally, learning to put down. There was a woman who had held everything together when everything was coming apart and had built something new out of the pieces. There was a life, a real one, built by 2 people who had decided to build it together. The sun went down warm over Sterling Ridge. Before we part ways tonight, I want to sit with this story for just a moment longer, because a tale like this one doesn't come along just to entertain you. It comes along to remind you of something you already know, but may have forgotten somewhere along the road. Lydia Mercer didn't survive because she was lucky. She survived because she refused to let fear make her decisions for her. When every person in that town square looked away, she looked straight ahead. When they stayed quiet, she spoke. When they accepted what was happening as inevitable, she stood between her children and the worst of it and made her voice heard anyway. That is not a small thing. That is one of the hardest things a human being can do, to act with courage when the crowd has already decided that courage is too expensive. She teaches us that the moment you stop speaking for what is right is the moment. Injustice wins without even having to fight for it. And then there is Garrett, a man who had every reason to stay on his ridge and let the world burn without him. A man carrying wounds so deep He could not sleep through a quiet night. He did not ride into that square because he was fearless. He rode in because his conscience would not let him ride past. There is a lesson in that for every one of us who has ever told ourselves that someone else will handle it, that one person can't make a difference, that it's safer not to get involved. Garrett's one gold coin changed the fate of an entire family. One decision, one moment of choosing what's right over what's comfortable. Never underestimate what a single act of decency can set in motion. This story also has something quiet to say about trust, not the kind that arrives overnight wrapped in promises. The slow kind. The kind built in shared meals and long silences and hard nights and the 100 small moments where a person shows you who they really are when nothing is watching. That is the only trust worth having, and it is always worth the wait. And perhaps most of all, this story reminds us that family is not only who you are born to, it is who you choose to stand beside. It is who holds your hand in the dark. It is who your children call home. The West was hard, but the people who built something real out there were harder and kinder and braver than they ever got credit for. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, and dialogue are fictional and do not represent any real persons or historical incidents.